Coming up on this week's episode, Craig Shim from Project Global Citizen joins us to discuss scholarships, hiring international students, and a cash cow update, plus all sorts of international student news, all coming up on The James Rice Show. Now, why would employers think that international students bring a liability to their company?
So let's say, for example, we've got two students or two graduates who are applying for the same job in an Australian company. Now, the employer might ask both of those candidates a simple question about why are you here, or what would you do in this certain situation. Now, with an Australian candidate, they're probably quite skilled from a cultural perspective in understanding or preempting what really the interviewer is asking about. And so they might start talking about their past experience. They might start problem solving and saying, look, in this particular situation, I would do A, B, C, or D. Now, for an international student who comes from a very different cultural background that might have they might have a different cultural perspective in terms of hierarchy, and then also a different perspective in terms of giving or receiving instructions. They might listen to what that interviewer is asking, and they might be thinking to themselves, number one, this interviewer is more senior than me, so therefore they're probably expecting a certain answer. And number two, they're probably thinking, well, I'm not really sure what the answer is that they're looking for. So I might just kind of skirt around the question and give some very generic answers. Now, obviously, from an Australian employer's perspective, if they're listening to candidate B, who happens to be an international student, and they seem to be skirting around the question and not really showing much initiative from an Australian perspective, that's where that employer might think, well, this student seems to have all of the academic skills, they've got their academic records, but they're just not a great cultural fit. And this is what we hear over and over again from both students and also from employers from our corporate contacts.
Wow, that's fascinating. That's a fascinating look into that insight into that world, because you would think often you hear, we need to think outside the box. We need to think outside I'm just so tired of that phrase. And then when you get a candidate that comes in who would allow you to give you a different perspective, they're afraid almost to hire them because they're not giving them the answers that they want to hear.
Yeah, look, and a really simple example, which I have come across fairly recently, was a lecturer was explaining this to me about her Japanese students who are studying here in Australia. They're doing tourism, and what she was saying is that those students would go for interviews for hospitality-related roles, and the Australian employers will often be testing them not just on their skill set, but also on their personality, because they want, obviously, their staff to have a good rapport with their customers. Now, if a Japanese student, for example, is, again, very conscious of hierarchy in an interview, they're more likely to kind of be quieter, do a lot more listening in the interview than perhaps what a Brazilian or maybe an Australian student might do. And therefore, the interviewer tends to think, well, if they're so quiet during this interview and they're not really forthcoming with their answers or their suggestions, then how well are they going to go in terms of quickly building a rapport with our customers? So that's like a really practical example. And in Project Global Citizen, these are the kind of things that we really want to highlight to students, because they probably don't know, they probably don't realize that their approach is highly culturally influenced and could end up being as a liability.
And I hear this as well when in Canada, we have a large multicultural community, and sometimes you have Asian owners, and they're looking to hire people from South America, for example, which is an expanding market. So we get a flip side of that where, there is an Asian culture and the Brazilian or the South American walks in and they're very vivacious, very outgoing, very communicative. And the Asian staff say, well, maybe they won't fit into our culture. I mean, isn't that interesting?
That's so true. And James, I know that you've been traveling around the world a lot. I've certainly lived in a number of different countries, mainly around Asia, and I find that all the time there is an expectation that when it comes to particularly professional life, that there are certain rules, and it's common sense that you would behave a certain way in a particular situation. But from an intercultural perspective, we keep saying that there is no such thing as universal common sense, because common sense it really is heavily culturally influenced. So, for example, if you're negotiating in Australia, it might be common sense when it comes to a point in time in the conversation that, perhaps you don't agree with something, that we might use a term like, okay, tell you what, let's just pause the conversation and let's have a difficult conversation now. Let's call a spade, or let's just say things as they are. So that's very typical in both Australia, Canada, America, a lot of different cultures, not necessarily just Western cultures, but certainly that style of communication is what we would call common sense, or an appropriate way of handling a difficult conversation in the corporate world. But when you are dealing with, for example, in Asia, where I've spent a lot of time, that type of very direct approach and calling a spade is really not common sense at all. And in fact, I've seen plenty of business deals just fail because of simply, Australians or Americans, for example, trying to be fairly direct with their communication, not realizing that in Asia, as in many other cultures, there is the common sense approach is to have a much more diplomatic approach, or diplomatic communication style, which, from a Western perspective can look like, oh, you're being a little shifty here, or you're not really, getting to the point. But, things are really done differently around the world. And again, coming back to Project Global Citizen, what we want our students to do is to recognize, number one, what their own personal cultural norms are in a number of different situations, from academic to social to employability, and then to have a look at, well, what would they need to adjust if they are in the same situation in Australia, and what would they need to adjust if they are in the same situation in any other part of the world.
It's a great term, universal common sense. It's there is no universal common sense. I like that expression. Now, what are the issues? I mean, if we reverse this, what are the issues that Australians are facing, Australian business people are facing when going into China? What are those cross-cultural issues that they're facing?
Look, one of them is really not understanding the Chinese business mindset. So in Australia, for example, if we're doing a multi-million-dollar deal, we will, for sure, we will invest in a relationship, but it certainly will not be to the same level that you would need to invest in a relationship in China. Also, from a timing perspective, our focus is probably on getting that contract signed, and we might talk about let's say a 3-year contract. And so our whole focus on both the relationship and also the work scope is around that 3-year time frame. Now, that just does not work in Asia, particularly in China. I often refer to the 20-year rule in China, and it goes something like this. If you're doing business with someone in China, that person will be not just assessing not primarily assessing you on your technical skills or your track record. They will be very much assessing you on how much you are investing in the relationship. And at this point in time, if they can't see that that they can be in some kind of business relationship with you in 20 years' time, then they're probably not going to proceed, or probably not going to put much effort into it right now. That does not mean that they're necessarily looking at a 20-year contract, and they or you may be in different companies in 20 years' time, but that is the kind of just gives you a gist of what the emphasis is when it comes to that Chinese business mindset, how different relationship building is in China compared to relationship building in Australia.
And it certainly takes a little bit more time. And I guess, in the Western culture, we're under deadlines to meet certain, financial objectives, and it doesn't necessarily exist in China.
Yeah, you're absolutely correct. Even have a look at what our, for example, our government terms are certainly in Australia, they've tended to be much shorter, and governments are really looking at an election cycle in terms of, strategic policy, not all the time, but generally speaking. But you compare that with China and a lot of other Asian countries where they really have a much longer term view, and their election cycles are different. Their reporting cycles, even their financial reporting. In Australia, we do quarterly reporting, and that's not necessarily the same in other cultures that have a very different view in terms of their strategic outlook and their whole concept of time, really.
Fascinating. We have to get you to expand Project Global Citizen to North America here, Craig.
I would love to do that, James.
All right. Well, thank you so much for your time, and best of luck with your tasks here and the scholarship and everything that you're doing down there.
It's such a pleasure. Thanks for the opportunity to chat again on the podcast, James.
All right. Have a good week.
Thanks.